The sky above the colony was a canvas of burning stars and black smoke. Lyra Voss stood amidst the ruins, her breath ragged, eyes wide with disbelief. Around her, twisted metal and shattered glass reflected the flickering fires that still licked the horizon. The colony she had once called home, the vibrant world of Novus Prime, was no more. It had died in silence and screams. Lyra's hands trembled, fingers clutching the cracked holocommunicator that still blinked weakly with static. The message had been clear. Psyche fleet approaching. Prepare for psychic assault. But no one had been ready, not even her. Her nightmares had begun weeks before the attack, visions that seeped into her dreams and wove themselves into waking hours. Faces of loved ones twisted into monstrous shapes. Voices whispered dark promises of destruction, and a cold shadow seemed to stretch over the colony's very soul. She had tried to warn the council, but they dismissed it as stress, paranoia, born from long space voyages and political tensions. Then the nightmares came true. The alien fleet wasn't just ships or weapons. They were psychic predators, beings who invaded minds and reshaped reality with terror. The attack had started, subtly, with whispers that twisted thoughts and shattered sanity. Then came the creatures, spawned from the darkest fears of every colonist, manifesting in flesh and bone, hunting and killing without mercy. Lyra remembered the screams. She remembered the friends who vanished, their minds consumed and bodies left empty. And she remembered running. Her boots echoed on the cracked pavement as she raced toward the last functional shuttle bay. The colony was already falling apart, alarms wailing like banshees, but somewhere inside a flicker of hope burned. She reached the shuttle, a battered craft patched with scavenged tech and hastily reinforced shields. The pilot was gone, either lost or fled. Without hesitation, Lyra climbed aboard and powered the engines. The ship shuddered as it lifted off, flames licking at its tail. Behind her, Novus Prime's skyline collapsed into rubble and smoke. Alone in the void, the silence was almost worse than the chaos. Her mind raced through memories and pain, but also through one burning resolve: survival. She would survive, and she would hunt. Days passed in cold, empty space. Lyra's only company was the ship's AI, an outdated system she had reprogrammed for combat and stealth. It whispered tactical updates and monitored life support, but offered no comfort. Her nights remained restless, haunted by visions of what she had lost and what still lurked in the darkness beyond the stars. Then, a signal shattered the silence. Faint, desperate distress call from a mining colony on the edge of known space. The voice was fragmented, terrified, but unmistakably human. Lyra's eyes narrowed. This was no accident. The nightmare was spreading. She set a course. Every jump through hyperspace was a step closer to the unknown. Her fingers brushed the hollow screen, fingers steady now. The hunt had begun. In the depths of space, where light faltered, and shadows grew long, a single truth echoed louder than any scream. Humanity was not broken. Not yet. Lyra Voss, scarred, hunted, but unbowed, would face the darkness and fight back. Not just for herself, but for every mind still free. Because some nightmares could be chased, some fears could be faced, and some horrors could be hunted. The A mining colony of Garanth 7 was tucked in the shadow of a gas giant, its surface pocked with deep excavation pits and mechanical arms stretching like giant, tired spiders. It was a place far from the center of human space, where the hum of industry often drowned out the silence of the stars. But now the silence was shattered. Lyra's ship dropped out of hyperspace just beyond the colony's orbit. The distress. Signal pulsed weakly, broken fragments of a desperate call for help. Her ship's sensors picked up no signs of conventional attack, but something was wrong. The psychic readings, subtle and erratic, were a telltale echo of the nightmare creatures she had fought to escape. Steeling herself, Lyra engaged the ship's stealth protocols and descended toward the surface. The mining colony was eerily quiet. She landed near the central hub, a sprawling complex of metal and glass, with blinking lights and sealed doors. The airlock hissed open, and she stepped into the dimly lit corridors, every sense alert. Then the shadows moved. The nightmare creatures emerged, not fully formed, but flickering in and out of reality like phantoms. Their forms were grotesque. Distortions of human shapes, elongated limbs, faces twisted into permanent screams, eyes glowing with a sickly light. They prowled the halls, drawn by fear and feeding on terror. Lyra drew her pulse rifle, voice calm but commanding. "Stay sharp. They're not just monsters. They're manifestations of the mind. Their strength comes from fear." From the comms, a voice crackled. "This is Kai, mining foreman. We're trapped in the processing wing. The creatures, they came from the deep tunnels. We can't hold them." Lyra responded, "I'm coming in. Stay where you are." She moved with purpose, each step measured. The creatures reacted to her presence, hissing and lunging, but she held her ground, firing precise bursts that shimmered with electromagnetic pulses, designed to disrupt the psychic energy binding them. In the processing wing, she found the survivors, a handful of miners huddled behind overturned machinery, faces pale and eyes wide with terror. "Kai," Lyra said, scanning the area. "What happened here?" Kai's voice trembled. "We were digging too deep. Something ancient. Something awake. The nightmares. It's like they followed us up from the tunnels. They don't just hunt us physically, they invade our minds." Lyra nodded grimly. "Then we need to get you out before it spreads." But escape wouldn't be easy, as they made their way through the tunnels, the environment twisted, walls warping, shadows lengthening into impossible shapes. The creature's presence was strongest here, and with every step, the miners' fear grew palpable, feeding the monsters. Lyra focused on calming them, using voice commands and physical reassurance to keep their minds anchored. Her own mind burned, with memories, but she pushed them aside. Suddenly, a creature lunged from the dark, wrapping its elongated arms around Kai. His screams echoed through the tunnels. Without hesitation, Lyra fired, disrupting the creature's psychic tether. Kai collapsed, gasping but alive. "We have to keep moving," she urged. They reached an old elevator shaft, rusted and barely functional. Lyra rigged a makeshift cable harness and led the group up, the creatures howling below. As they emerged on the surface, Lyra contacted her ship. "Prepare for immediate evac. We're compromised." The miners looked at her, gratitude and fear mingling in their eyes. "You saved us," Kai said, voice raw. Lyra shook her head. "I didn't save anyone yet. This nightmare is bigger than any one colony." As the ship lifted off, Lyra stared out at the receding world. The psychic trail she followed wasn't random. It was a map, leading deeper into the nightmare. And she was the hunter. The stars outside Lyra's ship flickered like distant pinpricks of light, but in the silence of the cockpit, there was only darkness. The faint hum of the ship's engines was a comfort in the emptiness of space. Lyra's hands gripped the controls, eyes trained on the console. The miners she'd rescued from Garanth 7 were safe now, on their way to a nearby colony. But something still gnawed at her, a feeling of unfinished business. She wasn't just hunting the nightmare creatures anymore. She was hunting for answers. She couldn't let the nightmares win. She couldn't let them follow her across the stars, but there was no escaping the pull. The signal had been faint at first, just a thread of psychic energy lingering in the distance. It wasn't the random resonance of a creature in hiding. It was a call, a deliberate attempt to lure her in. Lyra followed it, knowing full well that this was the edge of the abyss, but something in her, something primal, refused to turn back. Her comm system buzzed, breaking her concentration. The voice that crackled through the speakers was familiar, a cold, robotic monotone. "Commander Voss, you are receiving an encrypted distress signal. It's from the alien species you encountered. They are aware of your presence." Lyra stiffened. "Do they know what I am?" The AI, her only constant companion, didn't respond immediately. "They do." A chill ran down her spine. These were no mere monsters. They were predators who hunted minds. They had been watching her, perhaps for longer than she knew. A shudder passed through her. Her own thoughts felt muddied, as if something were pressing against the edges of her consciousness, probing. "Prepare for hyperspace jump," Lyra said, trying to shake off the feeling. She didn't have time for distractions. The ship jerked, hurtling through the void, but when it exited hyperspace, something was wrong. The stars looked wrong. The familiar constellations had shifted, twisted into unfamiliar patterns. The light of distant suns flickered in erratic bursts, and the fabric of reality seemed to warp in front of her eyes. Lyra clenched her fists, willing herself to focus, and then she heard it. A voice. No, not a voice. A whisper. "Lyra." Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized it. It was her mother's voice, clear as day, soft with love, but twisted, distorted. The tone was wrong, and Lyra could feel the tremor in her heart as her mind struggled to keep the memory intact. "Lyra, come home. The pain will stop. You can have it all back." "No." The whisper grew louder, more insistent. The images flooded. In her home, before it burned. The peaceful village where her mother had smiled at her across the dinner table. The warmth of a safe childhood. The sense of belonging. Lyra closed her eyes, shaking her head. "No, don't. Don't let it in." But the creatures knew her. They knew her pain, her fears, her broken dreams. The ship's systems began to glitch. The hum of the engine faltered, then sputtered. Lights flickered. Her hands flew across the console trying to stabilize the systems, but it was as if the ship itself was bending to the pressure of the psychic assault. She could feel them now. The creatures, the invaders, pushing against her mind, trying to breach her thoughts, trying to reshape her reality. Her pulse raced as the ship's hull buckled under the psychic weight. In the distance, she saw it, the core of the nightmare. A swirling mass of darkness, so vast it seemed to consume everything, a void that stretched beyond the fabric of the universe, and standing in the center of it was an alien figure, a grotesque creature with multiple eyes, each one filled with a different shade of fear, its smile twisted like a wound. "Come closer, Commander," it whispered, its voice 1,000 overlapping screams. "There is no escape. You are ours." "No." Lyra's mind screamed. "No!" She dug deep, drawing on the primal part of her humanity, the part that survived the colony's fall, the part that had escaped their first trap. With a fierce roar, she slammed her will against the psychic pressure, forcing her mind back into control. The alien presence recoiled in surprise as Lyra's consciousness flared like a bright star, pushing against the void. The ship lurched forward, snapping free from the psychic grip, and she slammed the control panel to re-engage the jump drive. The stars swirled again, and the nightmare retreated. Lyra exhaled shakily, her chest rising and falling as the ship shot back into hyperspace. The distant figure of the creature, its dark eyes fading into the abyss, still lingered in her mind. "Are you okay, Commander?" the AI asked softly. She nodded, though she felt anything but okay. Her pulse was still racing. Sweat clung to her. "Skin, I'm fine," she lied. "Just don't let me forget why I'm doing this." The AI's voice was quiet, almost sympathetic. "Understood." Lyra glanced back at the stars, now silent again. But she knew deep down that the nightmare wasn't done with her. It was watching, waiting, and she would hunt it down, no matter the cost. Lyra's mind was still buzzing from the encounter. The memory of that alien creature, its presence like a void that stretched through her thoughts, lingered, a cold weight on her chest. Every inch of her body itched with the need to push it out, to rid herself of its touch. But even as she tried to shake off the lingering echoes of the nightmare, she couldn't ignore the undeniable truth. There was something bigger at play. The aliens weren't just hunting her. They were hunting everyone. They were spreading, growing stronger with every mind they consumed. She couldn't do this alone, not anymore. The ship's console beeped, a low, insistent tone. A new signal, one that shouldn't have existed. Lyra leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. The signal was coming from a derelict station, Xerox 11, on the edge of uncharted space. She had heard whispers of it. It had once been a research facility, abandoned after a mysterious explosion. But that wasn't why the signal caught her attention. It was human. Not an automated distress call, not a dead transmission, but someone alive out there, sending coordinates. Her mind flashed back to the voice she'd heard earlier, the distorted whisper from the nightmare. Had it been real, or was it another mental trap? Lyra didn't hesitate. She set a course for Xerox 11, trusting that this was no coincidence. Xerox 11 loomed ahead like a rusted ghost in the dark, its once gleaming. Structure now corroded by years of neglect. Docking was a challenge, the station's systems barely functional, but Lyra managed. The landing bay was eerily silent, and the air was thick with dust. She armed herself with her standard pulse rifle and a short blade, knowing she couldn't afford to take any chances. As she stepped into the dimly lit corridors, a sense of foreboding crawled up her spine. It didn't help that the station's interior was a labyrinth of abandoned rooms and collapsed walkways. But there was something else. The air. It felt wrong. It felt tainted. She followed the faint signal through the twisted wreckage, turning a corner to find the source of the transmission. A man, dark skin, sharp features, and a uniform that had once been part of the Earth military, was crouched next to a broken terminal. His eyes were wide, but there was no fear, just understanding. He turned slowly as Lyra approached, his expression unreadable. "You're here," he said softly. "I wasn't sure anyone would come." Lyra kept her rifle raised, her gaze cold. "Who are you? And what are you doing here?" The man straightened, brushing dust from his uniform. "I'm Captain Eric Hale. I was part of the expedition team that first encountered the nightmare creatures. I've been tracking them ever since." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. "You know what they are?" "I've seen them up close." Hale's voice dropped, as though the very memory of them could break him. "We thought we could contain them, study them, but they adapt." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "They get stronger every time we try, and now I'm the last one left. All my people are gone." Lyra's mind raced. She'd been hunting alone, but the more she heard, the more she realized she wasn't the only one. And Hale, there was something familiar in his eyes. He had faced them, just like she had. "You don't look like someone who's alone," Lyra said cautiously. "Why did you call for me?" Hale stood, wiping his hands against his pants. "I've been tracking the source of the nightmare signal. I can't go any further on my own. And you can't do this alone either. We need each other." Lyra narrowed her eyes. She'd learned not to trust easily, not after what she'd been through. But there was a spark in Hale's demeanor that spoke of the same kind of fire that burned in her chest. Desperation, survival, rage. "Why me?" she asked. "Why not just go to the fleet, get reinforcements?" "The fleet is gone," Hale replied with a cold finality. "You're the only one who survived this long and lived to fight back. If we want to end this, we need you." Lyra felt her pulse quicken. The weight of the decision was almost suffocating. Her every instinct screamed at her to remain alone, to rely only on herself. But the reality was clear. The nightmare was not a war she could win on her own. She exhaled slowly, a dark resolve setting in. "All right, Hale. We do this together," Lyra said, her voice steady. "But if you try anything, I'll kill you before the creatures get the chance." Hale cracked a tight smile. "Understood, Commander." Together they stepped into the shadow of the station's depths, where the real nightmare waited. The uneasy alliance had begun. The nightmare would face them both now, its greatest hunter, and the one who knew it too well. The cold, damp corridors of Xerox 11 had long since fallen silent. But Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't the faint hum of old machinery or the occasional creak of metal settling in the quiet. No, this was something different, a presence that stirred the hairs on the back of her neck. Captain Hale led the way, his footsteps careful and measured. Lyra's eyes remained trained on his back, scanning their surroundings for any sign of movement. But it was the atmosphere itself that unsettled her. The very air felt wrong, as though reality itself had been twisted into something alien. "How far are we from the core?" Lyra asked, her voice a whisper against the thick tension. Hale glanced, over his shoulder. "Not far. Maybe 5 clicks. But it's the deeper you go into this station, the thicker it gets." She didn't need to ask what he meant. The creatures, the nightmare beasts, fed on fear. But here, in the heart of Xerox 11, the terror wasn't just from them. It was from the very place. The deeper they went, the more. The station felt like a living thing, something that pulsed with a life of its own, a dark, hungry pulse. They reached the heart of the station's labs, an old sealed chamber. The entryway was marked with fading biohazard symbols, the doors heavy with age and corrosion. Hale didn't hesitate. He tapped in a few commands on his wrist console, and the doors hissed open, revealing a room that looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. But Lyra knew better. The air here was thick with something, psychic energy, a malevolent force that she could feel crawling over her skin, pressing against her thoughts. Her fingers twitched, reaching for her pulse rifle, though she knew it wouldn't do much against whatever was waiting. Hale stepped into the room first, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The terminal at the far side of the room flickered, with dim light. Lyra followed, but as she crossed the threshold, she felt it. The sudden shift. The room stretched, warped, the walls bending as though made of liquid. The floor tilted, and she had to catch herself on the console to steady her. "Balance! What the hell?" Hale started, but he was cut off as the room twisted again, pulling at the very fabric of their reality. Lyra's breath hitched. This wasn't just a lab. This was the nightmare. The creatures didn't need to materialize in flesh. They could reshape the environment itself, turning it into a living thing, a twisted reflection of what they wanted you to see. A flash of movement in the corner caught Lyra's eye. A figure. Her mother. The woman stood just beyond the distorted doorway, her back turned. The faint sound of Lyra's name echoed through the chamber, twisted and warped. "Lyra, come to me." Lyra's chest tightened. Her mother had died years ago, killed in the invasion that had shattered her world. But there she was, impossibly real, standing at the edge of the nightmare. "No," Lyra murmured, but the words felt thick in her mouth, as though the very atmosphere here was sucking away her resolve. Hale's voice snapped her out of it. "Lyra! Focus!" But it was too late. Lyra's world splintered. The room stretched out of control, every surface warping like liquid, as if the station itself were trying to devour her. The shadows flickered and danced, taking on monstrous shapes, claws, teeth, eyes. Her heart raced, but she fought to steady herself, to cling to the one thing she knew for sure. She wasn't going to let this thing win. Not again. The figure of her mother turned, her face a horrific mask of anguish, her eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the very light. "You've failed me, Lyra," the voice rasped, 1,000 distorted whispers packed into a single sentence. "You'll never escape." Lyra's mind screamed in protest, but she refused to give in. She shoved aside the overwhelming sense of dread, focusing on the one thing that anchored her, the mission. The creatures wanted her weak, scared. If they could drag her back into the past, into her memories, they could take her. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She would not break. With a sharp breath, Lyra snapped her eyes shut. The vision of her mother shattered. No, the illusion fell apart as she ripped it from her mind. She concentrated, forced her thoughts into a single, unyielding point. The room trembled again, and this time the walls cracked. The shadowy hands that reached for her dissolved into mist. Her pulse quickened, the oppressive weight lifting. She opened her eyes, finding herself standing in the center of the lab once more. Everything normal, if only for a moment. Hale was looking at her, concern in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. He just knew. They both knew that something more was coming. The nightmare had only just begun to show them its full power. Lyra wiped the sweat from her brow, her mind still shaky but her resolve solid. "We can't stop now," she said, her voice low but certain. "This place is where it all starts. If we don't take it down here, the nightmare will spread. Beyond this station, beyond the galaxy." Hale nodded grimly. "Then let's end it." The hunt was far from over, but now they were no longer just survivors. They were hunters. Lyra and Hale stood at the threshold of the core room, the walls of Xerox 11's heart pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, as if the station itself were alive, aware. A sickly light flickered from within, casting the room in shifting, distorted shadows. Every inch of the space felt like it was teetering between dimensions, caught between the world they knew and the nightmare reality that was slowly consuming it. Lyra's pulse thrummed in her ears as she tightened her grip on her pulse rifle. Every instinct in her screamed to turn back, to leave the horror of this place behind. But there was no escaping it. Not anymore. If they didn't end this now, it would only spread further, infecting the entire galaxy. "You ready?" Hale asked quietly, his eyes scanning the swirling shadows around them. There was a steely calm to his voice, but Lyra could hear the unease beneath it. He had been in this situation before. He had seen the creatures, fought them, but even he knew the stakes now were higher than ever. "As ready as I'll ever be," Lyra replied, her voice low, barely above a whisper. Together, they stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the heart of the nightmare. The room inside was an abomination. What had once been a research facility had been transformed into something far more sinister. The walls were lined with grotesque patterns of pulsating veins, and the ceiling above them stretched impossibly high, obscured by a swirling darkness that seemed to bend and warp the very fabric of space. At the center of the room was a massive, spherical object suspended in midair by an invisible force. It crackled with energy, psychic energy, pure and unfiltered, rippling through the air, distorting the room itself. "That's it," Hale said, his voice tight. "That's the source of the signal." Lyra's stomach twisted as she took in the sight of the orb. She could feel its presence, a cold, gnawing force that scraped at her mind, tugging at her thoughts. It was like a wound in the fabric of reality, a black hole that devoured everything it touched. And it was feeding on something, or someone. "Are you seeing this?" Lyra murmured, staring at the orb, which flickered with images, distorted. Memories, fragments of broken minds, faces twisted in agony, voices calling out for help. They were all coming from the orb, drawn in by its pull. Hale nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's a psychic nexus, a focal point where the nightmare creatures are born. This thing is what's causing the rift in reality. It's feeding on minds, human minds, alien minds. Everything that's close enough gets sucked in. Lyra's blood ran cold as she realized the full scale of what they were up against. The creatures weren't just born from fear. They were created here. This orb was the heart of the nightmare. Its seed. Then we need to destroy it, Lyra said, voice low but steady. She glanced at Hale, seeing the same determination mirrored in his eyes. We can't let it spread. Hale reached into his pack and pulled out a small device. It was a plasma charge, small but powerful enough to destabilize the core. This should do the trick, he said, his hand shaking slightly as he activated the device. Lyra nodded, stepping back as Hale placed the charge on the base of the orb. We need to hurry, she said. We don't know how long it'll take to destabilize. But just as Hale finished setting the charge, the room shifted. The walls trembled, the very air growing thick with psychic pressure. The orb pulsed with an almost sentient malice, its light turning from sickly yellow to deep crimson. The ground beneath them began to crack, and a low growl reverberated through the air. "No!" Lyra shouted, but it was too late. The nightmare. Creatures began to emerge, their forms materializing from the cracks in reality. Twisted, grotesque reflections of humanity, with glowing eyes and jagged limbs, they filled the room, more than Lyra had ever encountered before. It was as if the nightmare itself had sensed its impending destruction and retaliated with a fury unlike anything they had seen. "Get back!" Hale shouted, raising his weapon. He fired, sending a pulse of energy toward one of the creatures, but it barely flinched. The attack had no effect. The creatures were too strong. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she fired her own pulse rifle. The blast tore through one of the nightmares, but the creature dissipated, only to reform again moments later. "We have to destroy that thing now!" Lyra screamed. "Before they overwhelm us!" Hale was already moving, his face set with grim determination. He glanced at the charge on the orb. "It's not ready yet. We have to—" Suddenly, the air was split with a terrible shrieking noise. The orb began to crack, its surface splintering, releasing waves of psychic in. The explosion was like a pulse of pure energy, a shock wave that rippled through the station's core. The orb, the heart of the nightmare, shattered with an ear-splitting roar, sending cracks of dark energy spiraling outward, tearing through reality itself. Lyra was thrown back, the world spinning, her body crashing against the floor as the station buckled around her. Her ears rang, the sound of the explosion still echoing in her skull. The walls of Xerox 11 seemed to collapse inward, groaning under the strain of the ruptured core. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and ozone. But the nightmare was not over, not by a long shot. Lyra shook her head, forcing herself to her feet. Her body ached, and there was a metallic taste in her mouth, but her eyes were locked on Hale, who was already moving, pushing through the chaos of the crumbling room. He was breathing heavily, his face pale but determined. Did it work? Hale shouted over the roar of the station's destruction. Lyra's gaze flickered toward the remains of the orb, now a fractured mass of crackling energy and shattered psychic fragments. For a moment the room was silent, unnervingly so, and then the creatures appeared again, emerging from the cracks in reality, their forms more twisted than before. They were stronger now, their bodies writhing with psychic energy, as if they had been fed by the explosion rather than destroyed. "No," Lyra whispered, eyes widening in realization. "It's worse than before." The nightmare creatures roared in unison, the sound like 1,000 tortured souls screaming at once. They began to move toward them, their glowing eyes fixated on the two of them, hungry, merciless. Lyra's pulse raced. She fired her rifle, but the shot barely fazed them. The creatures just kept coming, their forms warping and shifting like dark smoke. "Hale, get us out of here," she shouted, her voice strained with desperation. "We can't fight them! This station's going down!" Hale's eyes darted around as he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the exit. The station was on the brink of collapse, its structure groaning under the weight of the psychic rupture caused by the orb's destruction. The walls were caving in, the lights flickering like dying stars. They sprinted through the twisting corridors, the nightmare creatures closing in behind them, their glowing eyes casting an eerie light in the darkness. Every step they took seemed to echo louder in the collapsing station, and the pressure in the air grew heavier. Lyra's breath came in short gasps as she glanced over her shoulder, firing off another shot that missed its target. The creatures were relentless. They didn't seem to care about the station falling apart around them. They only cared about one thing: feeding. A flash of movement caught her eye. An opening, a way out. "The escape pod bay! Over there!" Lyra shouted, pointing toward the flickering door ahead. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning as the adrenaline surged through her veins, but the creatures were gaining. One of them lunged toward her, its claws slashing through the air, inches from her face. She rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its strike, and fired at it, but the shot only made it stagger. It didn't stop it. Hale was already at the pod, the door opening with a hiss. "Hurry, Lyra!" She didn't hesitate. She dove into the pod just as the ceiling above them collapsed, sending a wave of debris crashing to the ground. The pod's door slammed shut, and Hale immediately engaged the launch sequence. The station shuddered violently as the escape pod shot into space, the fiery remains of Xerox 11 fading behind them. But even as they broke free from the dying station, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over. The creatures, their whispers still lingering in her mind, were still out there. And if they could turn a station into a portal of pure nightmare, what would stop them from doing the same to entire worlds? "Are we safe?" Hale asked, his voice ragged as he slumped into the seat across from her. Lyra looked out of the pod's viewport, her eyes scanning the distant stars. For a moment, the vast emptiness of space felt almost peaceful, but the peace was fleeting. "We might have escaped," Lyra said quietly, her fingers gripping the armrests as she tried to steady her breathing. "But the nightmare is still out there, and it's getting stronger." Hale nodded grimly, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Then we don't stop. We go after it, all of it." Lyra's eyes flickered toward him. She had survived hell once. She had survived the nightmare that tore her world apart. But now, there was something more at stake than her own survival. "If we stop now, there will be no one left to fight," she said, her voice cold and determined. "We find the source, and we end it, for good." Hale's gaze met hers, a silent understanding passing between them. They had both seen the horrors the nightmare creatures could unleash. They knew they couldn't rest until it was finished, until the creatures were eradicated from existence. And so, they set a course for the next system. No destination, just the next fight. The war was far from over. The stars stretched before them, endless and cold. The escape pod rocketed through the blackness of space, its sleek frame gliding effortlessly between the distant constellations. But inside, the silence was deafening. Lyra sat in the cockpit, her hands steady on the controls, but her mind was anything but. Every blink, every flicker of light outside the viewport felt like a threat. The nightmare creatures weren't gone. They were out there, and they were evolving. They were hunting, just as they had always done. But now, they had a new objective. Lyra. It had started with a station, then a planet. Now, who knew how far their reach extended? If they could tear through reality, if they could warp the fabric of space itself, what could they do to a galaxy? To the universe? Hale's voice broke through the tension. "We're approaching the next system, but I'm not picking up any signals. No signs of life?" Nothing. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she focused on the data coming in from the pod's sensors. She couldn't explain it, but her instincts, the survival instinct, told her that something was wrong. "Set a course for the nearest planet," Lyra said, her voice colder than she intended. "We need to see this for ourselves." Hale hesitated, but then followed her command. The pod shifted direction, its thrusters humming softly as it entered the outer rim of the system. Through the viewport, the planet loomed large, a distant, dark sphere that had once held the promise of life, but now appeared silent, hollow. Lyra's chest tightened. This was the one place the creatures had been drawn to. She could feel it in her bones. This world, this nothingness. It was their next hunting ground. The pod touched down on the surface, the ground beneath them cracked and barren, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The once vibrant landscape was now a wasteland, scarred by something she couldn't yet explain. Lyra and Hale exited the pod, their boots crunching against the dry earth. There was no wind, no movement, just the eerie, suffocating stillness. "Where is everyone?" Hale muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This place was supposed to have a thriving colony." Lyra didn't answer. Her hand instinctively went to the hilt of her blade as she sensed something stirring in the distance. Her pulse quickened. The creatures were near. She turned to Hale. "We move fast. We take them out before they can spread." Together they set off toward the colony's central hub. The abandoned buildings loomed over them, hollowed shells of their former selves. Lyra could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing against her, like the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then she saw it. At the center of the colony, the ground was cracked open, like some massive force had torn it apart from below. Dark tendrils of psychic energy snaked out of the fissures, their edges flickering with ominous light. From the depths of the rift, she could hear them, the whispers, the screams, the voices of the creatures. Hale raised his weapon. "It's a damn nest." Lyra nodded, her voice steady. "And we're going in. This ends now." They descended, into the rift, pushing past the twisted remnants of the colony. The further they went, the thicker the air became. The walls around them warped, reality itself bending under the weight of the nightmare's influence. The creatures were everywhere, silent, moving through the shadows. They didn't need to make noise. Their presence was enough. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she advanced, every step cautious, every movement deliberate. And then she saw it. At the heart of the rift, a massive, pulsating structure hung in midair. It was made of the same dark psychic energy that had destroyed Xerox 11, its surface shimmering with a twisted, nightmarish glow. It was the central node, the origin of the creature's power. Hale cursed under his breath. "We're too late." "No," Lyra said, her voice cold and sharp. "We're not." They didn't wait for the creatures to close in on them. Lyra pulled out a small, sleek device from her belt, one that had been custom-made during her time in the Resistance. A disruptor, capable of severing the psychic connection between the creature's mind and the rift. It wouldn't destroy the creatures, but it would cut off their connection to the source. Lyra didn't hesitate. She pressed the button, activating the disruptor. A pulse of energy rippled through the ground, the air crackling as the rift shuddered. The creatures howled in pain, their forms flickering, destabilizing. But just as the rift began to collapse, a massive, hulking creature, larger than anything they had encountered before, emerged from the center, its eyes glowing with the pure, malevolent energy of the nightmare. Lyra felt a wave